On the northern plains, as the herds vanished and rails met the horizon, one man refused to compromise. No speeches, no medals, only vision and duty to his people. Sitting Bull, seer or defier. Why did 4 years to the north matter more than one day of victory? Open the record telegrams, post, journals, administrative orders, to see why his role is too large for history to ignore. July 1881, Fort Buford, Missouri River. A man who had refused treaties now stepped across a military threshold and set down his rifle. He was Tatanka Iyotake of the Hunkpapa Lakota, known widely as Sitting Bull. Around him stood families thinned by years of hunger on the northern plains. Army officers recorded names. Interpreters waited. The river moved past the bluff with steady force. This life stretches from Grand River Dakota Territory, about 1831, to Grand River Standing Rock Agency on 15 December 1890. Across those years, the northern plains changed under rail surveys, mining rushes, and the fall of the buffalo. The principal actors in this account are the Hunkpapa Lakota and allied Lakota bands, the United States Army departments of the Dakotas and the Platte, the Indian Office at Standing Rock, and the Northwest Mounted Police at Wood Mountain and Fort Walsh. Each held a mandate and a limit. Each wrote orders or kept ledgers that survive. The question is direct. Who was Sitting Bull, and how did vision, leadership, and exile join in one life to shape choices at Little Bighorn, Canada, and Standing Rock? Why did those forces decide his end in the winter of 1890, and what endures among Hunkpapa Lakota communities today? We will follow dated orders, ration lists, and letters. We will mark the line between record and folklore with care. We will keep places precise and the voice steady. Tatanka Iyotake was born about 1831 near Grand River in Dakota Territory. He came of age as a Hunkpapa Lakota hunter and defender. In that generation, the northern plains still held large buffalo herds. Trade goods entered through river posts on the Missouri. Iron tools and firearms were common. Horses were wealth and freedom of movement. In 1849, the United States placed Indian Affairs under the Department of the Interior. Forts grew along trails and river bends. In 1851, at Fort Laramie, many nations met federal commissioners. The treaty drew lines that migrants soon crossed. It promised annuities and goods and help in keeping peace along roads. The paper assumed traffic would be limited and predictable. It was not. Through the 1850s and early 1860s, settlers moved under the Homestead Act. Mail and freight streamed along the Platte and the Yellowstone. Surveyors pushed out from railheads. The Northern Pacific Survey parties marked routes near the Yellowstone River by 1872 and 1873. Escorts fought along bluffs and fords. The line on the map kept advancing even when crews pulled back each whistle. In 1868, a second Fort Laramie treaty recognized a large Lakota domain that included the Black Hills and reserved hunting grounds west to the Powder River country. Army posts were to withdraw from the heart of Lakota lands. The paper assumed buffalo would endure, and agencies could feed people near the Missouri. Within 6 years, those assumptions failed. In 1874, an expedition under George A. Custer reported gold in the Black Hills. Miners rushed in despite the treaty. The United resource lines tightened. Market hide hunting rose fast after 1870. By the mid-1870s, the southern herds were broken. The northern herds began to crash. Every winter, the chase grew long. Policy shifted with the pressure. Interior agents issued passes, rations, and orders for school attendance. When large bands stayed off the rolls near the Yellowstone and the Powder River, the War Department prepared to compel a return. In late 1875, a commission ordered all Lakota off the agencies to report by 31 January 1876. Families were in winter camps. Travel with children and teepees in sub-zero winds was slow. The deadline created a legal ground for military action. Orders followed. In spring and summer 1876, 3 field columns under George Crook, John Gibbon, and Alfred Terry moved to find and break villages. The plan assumed dispersed camps and short fights. It did not plan for a united village that could mass riders and hold ground. Telegraph lines linked forts like Fort Abraham Lincoln to department headquarters. Beyond the lines, scouts and interpreters set the pace of knowledge. Courier rides took days. Misread distances and numbers became common. Objectives and constraints for the Hunkpapa Lakota and allied bands were clear. The objective was to preserve land game and the right to move under Lakota leaders. The means were horses, ammunition, and the camp economy of hides, meat, and trade goods. The constraints were winter fuel hunger and the shrinking arc of the buffalo range. Powder stores were limited to what traders would sell and what could be taken in raids. Pony herds needed grass and water along river valleys. A broken herd in spring meant less reach in summer. Objectives and constraints for the United States were also clear. The objective by 1856 was to force all off-agency bands to submit to agency control and to clear the Black Hills for non-native use. The means were converging field columns, scouts, and supply trains, and later the agency police system that could seize leaders without field battles. The constraints were distant season and intelligence. Wagons crawled on gumbo roads after rain. River levels set freight schedules. Commanders managed biscuit beef and forage by the pound. Ammunition moved in wooden crates. Every day out from a depot reduced initiative. Immediate triggers multiplied. Reports of raids along the Yellowstone created calls for retaliation. Miners in the Black Hills demanded permanent protection. Contractors warned that beef deliveries would fail if roads were unsafe. Agents cut rations to force movement to schools and to punish camp leaders who refused new rules. Disarmament orders appeared in the late 1870s and later again in 1890 as peace officers tried to control gatherings. Each winter stress deepened the cycle. Each spring, new surveys and settlers widened it. By early 1876, the stage was set. Treaties that had promised distance now framed pursuit. A legal deadline replaced a hunting season. The buffalo decline pulled families toward agency ledgers, while pride and prudence pulled them away. Telegraph clicks and department offices could not feel wind on the Powder River or count lodges in a wide valley. The lines that would carry Tatanka Iyotake to Canada and then back to Standing Rock were already drawn in policy paper and in hunger. June 1806 opened dry and hot on the northern plains. The grass along Rosebud Creek stood high but brittle. On 17 June, near Rosebud Creek, the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne met George Crook. The Hunkpapa Lakota rode in with Oglala Lakota and Miniconjo Lakota allies and Northern Cheyenne scouts who knew every draw and ridge. Tatanka Iyotake did not give tactical orders on the field. His role had been to hold the camp together in the weeks before the fight and to commit the men to one purpose. The fight ran for hours over rough ground. Ammunition belts emptied and filled again. Couriers crossed the lines with hand signs and shouts. Heat and dust climbed. Near dusk, the combined force pushed Crook off the field and south toward Goose Creek. The telegraph could not carry that outcome from the Rosebud to Yellowstone posts. Runners did that work. They took days and added doubts. Crook did not move north to join John Gibbon and Alfred Terry as planned. That delay mattered. By 24 June, the large village had moved along the bends of the Little Bighorn River. The Hunkpapa Lakota and allied bands placed lodges in long arcs by water and grass. Pony herds grazed beyond the cottonwoods. Scouts reported soldiers nearby. Some messengers spoke of a single regiment. Others warned of a larger converging force. On 25 June, George Custer led 5 companies down the bluffs toward the northern end of the village. He sent Major Reno to strike the southern end. The day was hot. Smoke hung over the river after the first volleys. Interpreters in the village moved between camps trying to carry warning and to keep non-combatants away from the fire. The village did not break. Riders crossed the fords in waves. Reno fell back across the river and dug in on a ridge. Farther north, Custer's companies were cut off and destroyed. The first clear report reached Terry and Gibbon by courier late on 26 June. The telegraph carried the shock east from the Yellowstone a day later. Numbers swelled in rumor. Families began to drift away from the great camp at once. The immediate effect was both pride and fear. Pride that a village had stood. Fear that the response would come in winter and would not stop. Through July and August, the village broke into smaller units. The Hunkpapa Lakota kept together for a time, then split by choice and necessity. Scouts in army pay followed tracks along the Tongue and the Powder. Powder and lead grew scarce in some camps. Hunters ranged farther and found fewer buffalo. By autumn, couriers brought word of a winter campaign. Everyone knew what that meant. In winter, the wind cuts and horses fail and children slow the trail. The fight turns into capture and seizure. Some families made for agencies on the Missouri to secure rations before the freeze. Others stayed in the unceded lands and hoped to avoid patrols. Each choice had a cost. Agency life meant surveillance and dependency. Staying out meant hunger and a greater risk in the snow. In early 1807, the pressure ratcheted. Cold locked the rivers. The army worked to break pony herds and seize powder. Some Oglala Lakota groups under Crazy Horse moved toward surrender at Red Cloud Agency to preserve families. The Hunkpapa Lakota Corps under Tatanka Iyotake aimed north. The logic was simple. The buffalo range was failing, but there was still some game near the Cypress Hills and Wood Mountain. Across the line lay posts of the Northwest Mounted Police that would not allow raids south and would not permit American troops to cross and chase. The hope was to find a breathing space without handcuffs or pens. In late spring and early summer, the Hunkpapa Lakota crossed to British territory. Lodges went up near Wood Mountain. Men hunted the scattered herds. Women tanned what hides they could. It was thinner than the old years, but it was their own camp. Primary source excerpt, the Sioux under Sitting Bull, since taking shelter in Her Majesty's Dominion have kept the peace though sorely pressed by want. They state they will not return to the United States without pledge of safety. Our position forbids coercion, so long as they obey our law. J. M. Walsh, letter, Fort Walsh, 1977. The words were plain and formal. They carried a policy that was at once humane and limited. The Post would not feed a nation in exile. Ottawa would not fund that scale of rations. The United States would not issue beef for people outside its agencies. The buffalo decline did not stop at a borderline on a map. By the winter of 1807 to 1878, thin horses and short powder stores strained the camp. Hunters rode long days. Children ate less. Old people went without. Traders were cautious. The exchange rates grew harsh. An old robe bought little flour. Ammunition boxes came open in smaller counts. Mission workers and reporters visited and wrote pitying lines that did not change the ledger of beans and beef. Signals and delays shaped every choice. Letters from Fort Walsh to Ottawa took weeks. Replies took a month or more. Messages from Standing Rock to Washington moved faster by telegraph, but still lagged behind each turn of the season. Interpreters carried meanings that could shift a tone enough to change an outcome. A word of warning in Hunkpapa Lakota could be heard as a threat in agency English. A promise from a commissioner could arrive as rumor rather than as a written pledge. Trust dwindled with each winter count that marked another failed hunt. By 1879 and 1880, families began to peel away from the Canadian refuge. Some accepted escorts south and surrendered at agencies to secure rations and blankets. Others stayed near Wood Mountain with Sitting Bull and tried again to make a winter off the chase. Each departure pulled a thread from the core of the camp. The leader's authority held on memory and on the promise to hold a line of autonomy. The material base under that promise kept shrinking. Couriers brought word that commanders in the Department of Dakota would treat a surrender with process rather than revenge. News of the deaths of friends and rivals reached the lodges. The calculus changed. In the spring of 1881, the prairie wind tasted of dust more than grass. The herds were a memory. The camps that remained near Wood Mountain saw the rails push deeper into the plains to the south. Traders talked more of policy than of powder. Interpreters repeated that the United States would not cross into British territory, and that the British would not feed refugees at scale. Hunger wrote the next line. In July 1881, Tatanka Iyotake chose to bring the remaining followers south to Fort Buford. That decision closed the period of rising incidents and opened the years of custody and agency control. The pressure that had begun with gold in the Black Hills and orders in winter ended with a grounded choice made in thin times. The path ahead would run through ledgers and passes rather than through battle smoke. The crossing south in July 1881 ended 4 years of movement beyond United States control and began a period ruled by ledgers and passes. At Fort Buford on the Missouri River, the surrender placed Tatanka Iyotake and the Hunkpapa Lakota remnant within War Department custody for transfer to an agency under Interior. The docket path was straightforward on paper and difficult in life. Army officers received weapons and tallied persons. Clerks opened entries that would follow families through rations and later allotments. Within weeks, the prisoners moved by river and trail towards Standing Rock Agency. The terrain was familiar in outline and altered in meaning. Where rivers had been lines of travel, they were now lines of audit. Where a lodge circle had been a sovereign home, it became a unit in a ration queue. Standing Rock Agency in the early 1880s was a dense system. The agent reported to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Orders moved down from Washington by telegraph and mail. Inspectors arrived by rail and wagon. Mission schools and an agency day school ran on strict schedules. A police force recruited from Lakota men enforced curfews, passed messages, and served warrants. Monthly issues of beef, flour, sugar, and coffee depended on delivery contracts and the compliance of the enrolled families with work details and school attendance. Each delay in freight was felt first by the children and the old. Each dispute over a rule risked the loss of a fortnight's issue. The first encounter between policy and symbol came in 1885, when the agent permitted a limited pass for Sitting Bull to join Buffalo Bill Cody's traveling show for a season. The administrative purpose was to test whether spectacle and wages might quiet a focus of resistance without overt coercion. The experience did not change his public stance. He returned to Standing Rock in the fall with money and stories and the same refusal to sign away more land. Fact and folklore diverge here. Reports in the press printed sharp lines attributed to his stage remarks that do not survive in interpreter notes. The reliable record shows short greetings and the sale of signed photographs rather than long boasts. The symbol endured on both sides. To supporters, he stood for refusal and memory. To the agency, he stood for a node where gatherings could form. By 1888, the next phase of policy moved on to the calendar. Commissioners arrived to push an agreement to break the Great Sioux Reservation into separate smaller parts and to open what the papers called surplus land. At Standing Rock, signatures were gathered in agency offices, sometimes after long talks through interpreters and sometimes after ration leverage and threats of withheld beef. The Hunkpapa Lakota leader would not sign. The docket in Washington listed votes and tallies and declared sufficiency. On the ground, that meant new survey stakes fencing and the first white homesteads near agency lines. It also meant deeper dependence on rations, as hunting options shrank to almost none. The police were busier. The pass system tightened. Any movement beyond the agency without a paper could draw a reprimand and a lost issue. In 1890, a religious movement from the far west reached the plains. The ghost dance promised renewal and a return of game through communal dances and moral discipline. At Standing Rock, the practice was uneven. Some families danced quietly on the edge of the agency, others declined. Agents in several reservations reported alarm. Washington responded with cautions and then with instructions to isolate what officials called leaders. The legal path is visible in letters and telegrams. Authority to arrest without civil indictment rested on the agency's police power over enrolled persons and on a broad reading of public safety within the reservation. The police commander at Standing Rock drew up lists and planned dawn moves to avoid crowds. Orders and after-action lines survive in summary form in files and recollections. Two brief excerpts mark the tone of the season. Make the arrests at the first safe moment and bring the parties before me without delay. Avoid bloodshed. Indian Agent Instruction to Agency Police / Standing Rock Agency, November 1890. Detach a reliable force to surround the place at daylight and prevent a gathering which might lead to conflict. Department Officer telegram to Agency, Department of Dakota, December 1890. The enforcement sequence around Tatanka Iyotake turned on one fact and two fears. The fact was that he remained an organizer of opinion whose presence drew visitors and petitioners. The first fear was that public detention in the daytime would bring a crowd that might resist. The second fear was that delay would allow him to ride south to Pine Ridge, where officials already struggled to manage Miniconjou Lakota camps. The plan fixed on a pre-dawn arrest at his cabin on Grand River, with a perimeter of mounted police and a quick removal to the agency office for transfer to the guardhouse. The ground reality was not a diagram. News traveled at different speeds on different tongues. Riders went out at dusk for routine tasks and carried hints. A cousin heard that horses had been kept saddled near the police quarters. Women cooking in the dark heard an extra clink of metal where no clink belonged. When the police entered the yard before sunrise on 15th of December 1890, the balance between command and community tilted with the first shouted name. Men from nearby lodges moved toward the cabin. Words were exchanged in Hunkpapa Lakota and in agency English. Hands went to rifles in the doorway. A weapon went off in the crush. Bullhead, the police lieutenant, was shot and fired in return as he fell. The leader died in the chaos. The tight plan dissolved into a field of shouting and broken fences. Casualties lay on both sides. The immediate humanitarian outcome was grim. Women and children scattered toward the river. The police column withdrew with the wounded and the dead. There was no field medic tent. There were no wagons idling with blankets beyond the first small curtain. Neighbors helped as they could while sleep began to fall. Casualty numbers appear in conflicting forms in concurrent reports and later testimony. Agency logs list the dead by name and roll for ration accounting and burial. Press stories broadened and blurred them. The conservative reading keeps the numbers to the persons named in agency returns and the police roster. The effect was larger than the count. Fear moved south faster than riders. Miniconjou Lakota, under Spotted Elk, already on the winter trail toward Pine Ridge, heard the news in fragments and resolved to continue under a white flag, rather than pause within reach of the same police power. The 7th Cavalry then moved and set the cordon at Wounded Knee Creek. The winter closed on the story. In administrative terms, the after-action report at Standing Rock framed the arrest as necessary and the deaths as the result of sudden resistance. In community terms, the event was a breach of a basic expectation of safety for a person long watched but not convicted in a civil court. The policy logic remained unchanged in Washington. If gatherings were construed as threats, then the remedy was detention of persons who might concentrate influence. In practice, the attempt to remove a symbol by force and darkness magnified the symbol. It also widened a season of panic in which good judgment thinned. The next 2 weeks show that plainly in the Valley of Wounded Knee. Fact and folklore needed a line here. Accounts that place elaborate ritual garments on every person in the yard at Grand River reflect a blending of general ghost dance imagery with this specific arrest. The reliable descriptions center on winter clothing and a close-packed scene at a family home before dawn. The belief that ritual shirts could stop bullets was present in pockets of the movement in that season, but the evidence that such shirts were worn at this arrest is weak. The stronger facts are simpler and harsher. There were many firearms in a small space. There were men who knew one another by name on both sides of the warrant. There was fear. That was enough. The logistics stress remained even in the hour of policy. The police detail rode on, thin feed and old saddles. The families in the cabins counted flour by the handful. The agent could issue a written order in one line. He could not issue warmth to the people who would be left without a provider after the smoke cleared. Winter took its own share of the casualties that year in the form of hunger and sickness among the bereaved. The confrontation ended not with a formal declaration, but with a series of small funerals in frozen ground, and with the routine of rations resumed at the warehouse door. The turning point came before dawn on 15th of December 1890 at the Grand River cabins within Standing Rock Agency. The persons were clear. Tatanka Iyotake of the Hunkpapa Lakota stood as a figure of opinion and memory. Agency police led by Bullhead carried the warrant. Behind them lay orders from the Indian Office and cautionary telegrams from the Department of Dakota. Around them were families who had followed the leader through war exile and return. The air was hard and cold. Frost held the corrals. Horses steamed. Each side had an objective and a limit. The agency aimed to remove a single person quietly and move him under guard to the office and then to the post. Avoid crowds. Avoid spectacle. Avoid a march that could draw riders from nearby camps. The constraints were thin manpower winter roads and the knowledge that any hesitation would spread news. The Hunkpapa Lakota objective at the cabin was basic: preserve the elder, prevent humiliation, keep the peace within reach of the lodge. Their constraints were ammunition counted in handfuls, the shock of a pre-dawn intrusion, and the weight of rigid policy that left no room to talk in the open sun. The first minute set the outcome. The police ring closed, voices rose in 2 languages, a hand went to a rifle, Bullhead took a shot, and in that wound sent his own bullet. The leader fell. Shavehead went down. Crowfoot the son was killed in the crush. The initiative shifted at once from planned detention to a crisis that would echo south. The policemen who could still mount pulled back with wounded and dead. Neighbors rushed to gather children and lift bodies. There were no wagons staged for care. There were no blankets laid in rows. A cold wind wrote the next lines. Admission against interest follows in a line that reached policy circles years earlier and went unheeded in the crisis. These people are not hostile by choice. Hunger and the destruction of the game drove them to extremities, and had we furnished food, many difficulties would not have arisen. N. A. Miles, Letter, Department of Dakota, 1877. The immediate effects were geographic and psychological. Word leapt from lodge to lodge and then to riders on winter trails. At Pine Ridge Agency to the south, a Miniconjo Lakota band under Spotted Elk had already set out to seek safety near friends and missionaries. News of the Grand River death reached them as rumor and warning. They kept moving under a white signal. United States troops under 7th Cavalry moved to control the approaches. The cordon tightened at Wounded Knee Creek. Within 2 weeks, the season ended in fire. The path from the arrest yard to the creek was a line of fear marked by snow and boot prints. The constraints that morning were material and administrative in the precise way that turns decisions into deaths. Ammunition was scarce in the cabins and low for the police detail as well. Rations were tight at the end of the year and had been used as leverage. Orders were brief and absolute. Weather was an actor without consent. It pressed every choice into a hard shape. In such a shape there was no space for a mid-morning parley before witnesses and interpreters in the yard. The procedure that might have calmed a day in spring could not be found on a winter morning in darkness. A narrow counterfactual can be stated and then bounded. If the arrest had been delayed to daylight, with a wider perimeter placed out of sight and a wagon at the door, and a rapid removal down a prepared track to a guardhouse, then the initial exchange of fire might not have occurred, and the name dead at Grand River might have lived. If an officer with authority had stood in the yard with an interpreter and declared a process rather than a seizure, the cabin might not have become a choke point. Yet the larger forces from earlier years still stood. The policy that made a spiritual leader into a security problem would have remained. The winter ration arithmetic would still have broken families. the belief in Washington that gatherings were threats would still have produced arrests. A different morning might have altered that day's roll call without moving the season's end. The human cost is recorded in agency logs, family recollections, and winter counts. Bullhead died of his wound. Shavehead fell. Crowfoot died. The leader's body lay in the snow and was later taken under guard. Women and children ran toward the river and huddled in cut banks. Old people were carried on robes. In one winter count, the year mark shows men with badges and a fallen long hair at a doorway. Names ripple outward in the weeks that followed. At Pine Ridge, the list of the dead at the creek includes women and boys whose kin had heard of the Grand River arrest and kept moving to avoid it. The displacement path is plain. Grand River to the agency road to Fear on the open prairie to Wounded Knee Creek, and then to grave sites under a low sky. The initiative shift after the shots at the cabin altered the balance of choice. Before the arrest, the agency could still claim authority through paper and the routine of issues. After the arrest, the claim rested on fear and the motion of troops. Families measured distance to safety in hours, not in rules. The agency ledger could not settle the air. That is the core of a turning point. It is when a system that had held people in place by ration and pass fails and only force remains. That force then produces a new record in which the language of necessity and unfortunate outcomes replaces the language of counsel. The file folders change, but the policy aim persists. The synthesis back to the prior forces is direct. The Black Hills Gold Rush broke the promise of the 1868 map. Railroad surveys and homestead law carried settlers into the margins of every agency boundary. The Buffalo Decline cut the surplus that had made winter endurable. Interior and War moved in step to make deadlines and to punish the refusal to sign. In that frame, the man at Grand River had long been a problem to be managed rather than a person to be persuaded. When the ghost dance arrived as a hope that came without weapons, the frame could not flex. The timing of the arrest shows the frame at work. It is winter. Rations are short. The agent fears a crowd. Washington fears a wave. The order leaves little room for prudence. What endures from that morning is not a single line in a report, but the pattern it clarifies. Policy operating under hunger will always present its demands as safety. A badge placed at a cabin door before dawn can carry a nation's weight and can tip a season into loss. The names at Grand River and the names at the creek are joined by that logic. The Hunkpapa Lakota and their relatives carry the memory in winter counts and on the rides that follow the arrest route each year. In that continuance, the turning point is not only a moment of death, but also a standing lesson in how structural pressures make violence likely when room for speech is removed. After the shots at Grand River, the administrative machinery closed ranks. Standing Rock Agency police filed returns that listed the dead and wounded and the seizure of arms. The agent reported up the chain to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington and to the Department of Dakota for coordination with nearby posts. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1890 and 1891 records the arrests that winter, the transfers of detainees, and the resumption of monthly ration issues at Standing Rock and Pine Ridge after the crisis passed. War Department summaries for the same years outline the patrol dispositions and the temporary reinforcement of agency guardhouses. Congressional notices logged petitions and protests from church workers and traders who had been eyewitnesses. None of these records reversed the policy logic. Passes remained required. Curfews remained in force. The police force kept its rolls full. Reservation boundaries hardened on paper, even as allotment laws began to dissolve landholdings inside them. The Sioux Agreement of 1889, printed in the statutes at large, had already set in motion the division of the Great Sioux Reservation into smaller parts and the opening of what officials termed surplus lands. After 1890, survey stakes appeared in new lines near Standing Rock Agency. The Commissioner reports for 1892 described the first full allotment schedules there with acre counts by household and the establishment of trust periods. Annuities and rations continued, but the language shifted from treaty obligation to administrative issue. Agents used ration leverage to compel school attendance and farm work. School placements expanded. Standing Rock Agency school registers from the early 1890s, together with admission lists at Carlisle in Pennsylvania and at Genoa in Nebraska, show dozens of Hunkpapa children transferred to off-reservation institutions under department orders. Letters in the files of the Office of Indian Affairs describe the assignment of students by age, trade preference, and health, and the returns for those who fell ill. Land and resources moved under new hands. Grazing leases were written to non-native ranchers for fenced tracts inside reservation lines, with receipts reported by the agents and audited in Washington. The Commissioner reports in the early 1890s tally lease acres and fees and note disputes over unauthorized grazing. Timber permits for agency use were tightly controlled. Rail spurs reached closer to agency borders from Bismarck and from Pierre, and freight houses appeared on the edges of Lakota country. Access rights to water and to crossing points were contested fact by fact, with the agent or the local superintendent issuing notices that could be appealed only slowly. The economic base for independent hunting had already failed with the buffalo. Now even the pasture for horse herds depended on a signed paper and a fence line. Demography and health numbers shifted in the ledgers. The Standing Rock Agency census rolls for 1890 to 1895 show the aftermath in columns that count births, deaths, and absences. Mortality spikes follow the winter of 1890 to 1891. Agents reported measles and influenza waves in the early 1890s. The Bureau's physician returns quoted in the annual reports attribute many deaths to respiratory illness worsened by poor rations and cold. Birth numbers fall in the same window, a pattern common across Plains agencies. The shift from teepees to agency-assigned cabins reduced mobility that had once allowed seasonal moves to healthier ground. By the mid-1890s, population recovery steadied, but did not reverse the loss of elders taken in the hungry years. Mission correspondents wrote to Eastern newspapers about crowded dormitories and the need for blankets in winter. Those letters appear in regional press files and were clipped into agency scrapbooks. Cultural continuance adapted within constraints. Hunkpapa Lakota ceremony and language persisted in family circles, even as officials attempted to limit public dances and to ban the giving of gifts at large gatherings. The agent's orders restricting dances are quoted in the Commissioner's Correspondence section for 1890 and 1891, and then appear less frequently as policy softened later in the decade. Names for the seasons and for place were kept alive in quiet in kitchens and in grazing camps. Men and women who had traveled to Wood Mountain carried stories of the Northwest Mounted Police into the next generation. Those details survive in the NWMP correspondence from Fort Walsh and Wood Mountain for the years 1877 to 1879, and in early 20th century interviews. Ledger art from the period shows the sequence that the narrative has followed: a surrender, a ledger line, a badge, a winter trail. Winter counts mark the same. One Hunkpapa count for the year of the arrest draws a figure with a badge and a fallen leader at a cabin door. The precise image varies across counts, but the motif is stable. Memory moved into commemorations. In the early 20th century, families along Grand River held small memorial gatherings on the arrest date. After roads improved, riders organized to follow the route from Grand River to the south, as a way to remember the season that closed at Wounded Knee Creek. Local newspapers in North Dakota and South Dakota in the 1930s and 1940s described these rides in brief columns. Museums in Bismarck and Pierre acquired garments and shields collected in the 1880s and 1890s. Acquisition numbers can be traced in museum catalogs and in the annual report of the Smithsonian for some years in that period. In the later 20th century, claims for the Black Hills moved through the Indian Claims Commission and then to the Supreme Court decision in 1980 that found a taking and offered compensation a remedy that many Lakota communities refused in principle because land rather than money is the core of the claim. Those case summaries are condensed in federal reports and in legal digests. Present-day continuance is visible on the ground. The Hunkpapa Lakota as an autonym stand within the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota and South Dakota. Community programs support language revitalization with immersion classes for children and college-level courses for adults. A tribal college named for Sitting Bull operates in the region and has published language readers and recorded elders for classroom use. Cultural events bring together singers and riders. Memorial rides trace winter routes. Youth programs teach horsemanship and star knowledge on summer nights. Health services now report on diabetes and heart disease rather than on measles. Yet the work of food security continues in gardens and in buffalo herd management operated by the tribe. These activities appear in tribal annual reports, in state cooperative extension notices, and in the recent Commissioner of Indian Affairs summaries about tribal program compacts. 5 to 8 records have anchored this account in prose. The annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1890 to 1892 record arrests, ration schedules, school placements, and allotment steps. War Department reports for the same years lay out patrols and post strengths during the ghost dance season. Standing Rock Agency census and ration rolls list births, deaths, and distributions across the early 1890s. The Sioux Agreement of 1889, printed in the statutes at large, sets the legal cut that shaped land tenure in the decade after the surrender. Northwest Mounted Police correspondence from Fort Walsh and Wood Mountain establishes the terms of the Canadian refuge that preceded the return. School registers at Carlisle and Genoa show the names of children from Standing Rock and the dates of their placements. Later museum catalogs and Smithsonian annual reports record the transfer of Lakota material culture into collections. Together, these documents fix dates and places and show how administration replaced field campaigns while families kept language and ceremony alive inside those lines. Across the long arc, scholars converge on three conclusions. First, Tatanka Iyotake of the Hunkpapa Lakota embodied a form of leadership that joined spiritual authority to political resolve, allowing dispersed bands to act with shared purpose when treaties failed and buffalo declined. Second, the victory at Little Bighorn did not alter the structural forces already at work: gold in the Black Hills rail surveys across the northern plains, and the agency system that turned rations and passes into instruments of policy. Third, from the surrender at Fort Buford in July 1881 to the arrest at Grand River in December 1890, control shifted from field columns to administrative power, police details, school placements, and allotment, a doctrine of order that replaced campaigns with paperwork and warrants. Several points remain contested. Numbers at Little Bighorn and at the Grand River arrest are stable in the narrow ranges in agency and Army files, yet press accounts widen them. Careful histories keep to the conservative lists. The degree of centralized planning around the ghost dance at Standing Rock divides interpretations. Some argue diffuse religious practice with local adaptations. Others see a tighter circle of influence around the leader. Documentary trails favor the former. Lines attributed to Sitting Bull in the tour season recur in popular works without firm sources. Most academic treatments treat them as folklore unless tied to interpreter notes or stenographic reports. At Little Bighorn, the question of how vision and counsel translated into tactical action draws different emphases. Some credit a unifying spiritual role that set the stage. Others look for direct command that the record does not supply. The enduring legacy works on three planes. In policy, the season of 1890 confirmed a doctrine that administrative levers could achieve what winter campaigns could not, and it exposed the human cost when orders outran judgment. In reform, later federal reviews and public pressure helped soften dance restrictions and opened the slow road toward religious freedom protections in the 20th century. Legal struggles over the Black Hills set a precedent for claims that combine treaty text with takings law. As symbol, Sitting Bull stands for refusal and memory among the Hunkpapa Lakota, and across the northern plains, a face carried in winter counts, ledger art memorial rides, and language programs that bind past to present. The event endures in memory because one life made plain how vision and policy met on the northern plains, and how communities carried that meeting forward in language, ceremony, and law. Sitting Bull's role was not only on the battlefield, but in how a community endured. What's the single biggest lesson for today? Leading by vision, guarding community memory, or staying wary of promises on paper? Leave your takeaway below. Thank you for watching and subscribe the channel.